It is May 20th, 2024. I am with Mr. William Glennon, who's going to be telling me a bit about his service in Vietnam and some interesting tidbits prior to that. So, William, if you'd like me to call you William, when and where were you born?
I was born in Ireland, and I emigrated from Ireland in 1964. And I was born and raised in a small subsistence farm in the center of Ireland, the oldest of 10 kids, and there was very little going on in terms of opportunity or just getting ahead. So I had this idea that neighbors around, people had gone to the United States, and others had gone to Australia, and of course the majority of the people from our local community would go to England, and they hopped back and forth fairly regularly. I didn't particularly see myself going to England, and we had family, or my grandparents were had been in the United States in the early 1900s. I think they came over like 1899 and had a career for some years, as used to happen back in those days. And they came back in 1910, 1913 timeframe, and that was it. And so we had some distant cousins in the United States, and some of them came to visit. The Irish diaspora, they like to go back to Ireland and visit where the family came from. And I had my dad had a first cousin who came to visit, and he asked me, "Hey, would you like to go? Would you like, if you ever decide you want to come to the United States, I will claim you out." That's what's the name of the term, where you had to have a sponsor in the United States. So when I was 19, I had been working for my uncle in the lumber business, working in the woods and hauling logs, and that's hard work. And when I was a kid, initially, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I saw an aircraft flying by in Ireland. It was on the route from England and the continent going to the United States. And I looked up and asked Mom, what was that? And my mom said, that's an airplane, as it were. And I said, oh, I want to fly. So that's how the whole idea of I wound up in the United States Army in the aviation business flying. As a 7-year-old, a dream was to fly.
Wow.
So yeah. Anyway, I in 1964, I got my visas and all that stuff together. I came to Jersey City, New Jersey, and moved in with my cousin. Got a job working for the New Jersey Bell Telephone Company at the time. And one of the things that you had to do once you came to the United States, you got a green card, and then you also had to register for the draft, which was part of the deal at the time. And lo and behold, 9 months later, I got a draft notice, and I had two choices. I could have gone back to Ireland, or gone to Canada, or gone anyplace else, or go in the army. As it turned out, I decided to go in the army because I met several folks who were around New York and New Jersey. Some of the folks, the Irish community up there, they said, "Oh, it's a no-brainer. You do 2 years in the army, and that's it. You're out, and you get veterans preference for jobs, and there was lots of advantages. Nothing about the Vietnam War, and that it wasn't big in the news or in the media or anything at all in 1964. So by the time I got into the army in September 1965, I I was assigned to out of basic training to go to Fort Leonard Wood to become an engineer. And so there we learned how to do stuff like I was in demolitions, blowing up bridges and roads and all of that sort of stuff. And people have laughed about that and said, the U.S. Army must be crazy teaching you how to blow up stuff. This was this is about the time that the war, in Northern Ireland, the Irish Troubles was going on, and you had people blowing up pubs and bars, and so it seemed like a bit of a dichotomy that they're going to train me how to do that, and maybe go back to Ireland and whatever. But anyway, the interesting thing about first coming into basic training in the Army was everybody came in and they looked at everybody. We were raw meat. So they started doing diagnostic tests. And the idea of doing these diagnostic tests was to see, what did you know, or how, what skill or field we were going to put you into. And basically, I had your basic in Ireland. It was more a traditional liberal arts education, and so I tested out of everything that they threw at me. And so at the end of that, they said, "Well, you're qualified to do this, this, and this. You're qualified to go to OCS." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, I want to do that." And it turned out anyhow that wasn't as simple as it sounded. You needed to be a citizen and a whole lot of other things. But being the cantankerous young Irishman I was at the time, I said, "Oh, wait a second. You're telling me that you can draft me into the Army, but I can't do anything that I want to do in the Army." And they said, "Well, that's about it." I said, "Well, I want to get out then." This seems like my civil rights, my human rights have been challenged here. And eventually, anyhow, I was able to talk to folks who said that, well, if you pass a basic background investigation and you're cleared and all that, yeah, then you can go to OCS and you can become an officer if that's what you want to do. And I don't know if you know this but Ireland at the time was it was like a 51st state in terms of the way people were, because so much of the American, the FBI, the police, firemen, all of that, they were all Irish from going back for hundreds of years. And so you could come straight over here and pretty much do whatever you wanted to do. Yes. So that's how I wound up going to OCS and becoming an officer. While I was in OCS, they had one of the field problems we had involved an air assault operation. And so we had been down in Stewart County, Georgia, fighting with the gnats and the bugs and the swamp. And it was just brutal hot. This is August in Fort Benning, Georgia, or Fort Moore, whatever it's called nowadays. But it was just brutal. I got to tell you. And part of the end of the exercise was they had one of the flight school classes from Fort Rucker come by and pick us up to bring us back to the base. And so we loaded on the helicopters. And the first thing I noticed was these guys had a cooler strapped to the console of the helicopter. And we're sitting on there, sweaty, hot, thirsty. And the guy with the cool looking flight suit and helmet on opens the cooler up and passes out some ice cold Coca-Colas. And I was sold. And whoever was in charge of recruiting to go to flight school, that was part of what they did, because the very next day they said, anybody who's interested in going to flight school can come to a briefing and find out if you're qualified to go. I mean, I climbed over people just to get into that meeting. It was pretty cool, I have to admit. They climbed up about 3,000 feet, and it was cool up there. We got a cool breeze and a cold drink, and that was it. I was sold.
Incredible.
Yeah, it was.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, in OCS too, I mean, you've got a lot of different challenges and, like you said, field problems, but the fact that you were introduced to an aerial assault, that's incredible.
Well, yeah, it was. Yeah, we studied the tactics. You study the book, and then they brought the aircraft in. When the flight of aircraft comes in, and we're lined up in chalks or sticks as they called them at the time. Five or six per aircraft, and got on board, and then we moved from one location to another, and then we moved back to the base itself. But it was to me, it was the best recruiting effort I'd ever seen because that was it. Some guy shows up the next day and he's got a cool flight suit and wearing cool aviator shades. He said, not only do you get to fly, but you get flight pay. You know, all of these things to, a second lieutenant at the time was a very attractive proposition.
No kidding.
Yeah. But I mean, I was qualified at that time in the Army. We did not have an aviation branch like you do today. You had there was majority of the pilots were warrant officers, but the leadership, the platoon leaders, the company commanders, the operations officers, the commanders were all commissioned officers, but they came from the various Army branches. So we had artillery, armor, infantry mostly. You would take a tour and you would go do your flying, and it was most of my compadres from my OCS class. They loaded up on whatever aircraft were available and went straight to Vietnam after they got out of OCS, and we took up and tooled on down to Fort Walters, Texas, for almost a year's worth of flight school. So it was at that time we started to learn, or we were beginning to figure out what was going on in Vietnam, at least in general terms. And so on the day that I was supposed to graduate from flight school, or correction, from infantry OCS, was 2 years after I first came in the Army. And oddly enough, the first you had the compulsory service, or the draft service, was 2 years at the time. So on the day before my graduation from flight school, the day before I was commissioned, First Sergeant called me in his office and told me, he said, "No, Glennon," he said, "you're in a very unique position here." And I had no idea what he was about to say. I said, "Oh, so what exactly do you mean, Top?" He said, "Well," he said, "I've got your discharge here." He said, "You can take this discharge and go at the parking lot and throw your stuff in your car and leave. You're finished. Your Army service is complete." I mean, because I had completed my 2 years of compulsory service. And normally with OCS, you had commitment for a year or 2 years of service after you graduated and got commissioned. And I said, "Well, what about all that?" He said, "That's it." He said, "Like I said, you have the unique opportunity to leave." Well, I had spent the previous 6 months to going through hell, to put it mildly, going through OCS. And I decided I'm going to stay. And I stayed for 28 years.
Wow.
That was the thing. I found what I love to do, and they say if you find something that you really like, you never work a day in your life. And I didn't for 28 years. It was just, the way things fell out. I really liked being in the Army, and I loved the idea that I was commissioned, and I loved the idea that I was a pilot. And even though years later I went back and became an infantry officer and served a tour in Germany in the mechanized infantry in Germany before I came back again to aviation. It was just one freaking adventure after another.
That sounds like it. Well, in those early OCS days, and when you see these helicopters, in your mind, did you want to fly attack helicopters? Did you want to fly the slicks? Did you want to fly some of the transport, medevac? What were your goals?
My goals at the time were just to get to flight school, and that was the goal of everybody. And once you got to flight school, then you decided where you were going to be or what you wanted to do. And again, some of that was based on how you did in flight school, how you did as a pilot. And of course, 90%, or well, not maybe not 90%, 80% of the people that were going to be going flying slicks anyway. So when I finished flight school, instead of going directly to Vietnam, this was in 1968. And in 1968, they had the Tet Offensive. And one of the things that happened was they ran out of pilots, ran out of replacement pilots. They had aircraft and they didn't have people to fly them during the Tet Offensive, which was a problem. So a decision was taken in the Army someplace that we needed to have a pool of pilots that we could immediately reach out and fly if we have Tet 69. In other words, if we had another Tet Offensive. So instead of going to Vietnam right after flight school, I went to Fort Hood and joined an aviation unit down there, flying slicks. That's all they had in the unit. And was there for about 9 months before I got orders to go to Vietnam. So again, been after flight school, had gone back to Ireland and got married. My wife was she grew up about 5 miles from where I live at in Ireland. She was also here in the United States at the same, but separately. You usually got a year between tours. In other words, if they sent you from Fort Rucker and then you went to Fort Hood, you got a year, you theoretically had a year on station unless you volunteered to leave early, or you would leave. So when they were telling me I needed to get ready to go to Vietnam, I said, well, what about letting me go to some particular, I want to go to gunship school or do some of the other stuff. And so they sent me to the Loach School, the OH-6 Flying Scouts. So there was a scout instructor school and gunnery school there. So I went to Fort Rucker for, I guess, about 2 months, learned how to be an instructor in an OH-6. And that was my thought when I got to Vietnam. When I got to Vietnam, you reported in, and what do they need? They don't need scout pilots right now, Captain Glennon. They need lift pilots in the 101st. And the last time I ever flew an OH-6 scout aircraft was when I graduated from the qualification course.
Well, and I'm curious too, when you eventually get to flight school, I assume initially it's a lot of ground school work, understanding how helicopter functions, rotor wing in itself, and various lifts. But what kind of training helicopters did they have there initially?
They had the TH-55. They called it the Mattel Messerschmitt, and they had some old OH-13s and OH-23 model Hillers. And I was one of the guys who wound up flying in the Hiller in flight school. These were, I guess some of them were Korean War vintage. That were that were there in flight school. I mean, this is 66, 67, 68. And so again, there was most of them got to fly the newer, what was procured by the Army at the time. The TH-55 was a training helicopter. But I trained on the OH-23, which was a fine airplane, by no stretch of the imagination. The academics were sort of interesting. I mean, aerodynamics was a term I never really heard or read about until I had my first class at flight school. So one of the things that was interesting is the flight school people. If you grew up on a farm and you drove a tractor, like you rode a motorcycle or something like that, you had an understanding of how machines work. How when you press on the throttle, the reaction you get from a machine. So I think that in my particular class, it seemed like a lot of the people who were there they'd grown up in the country and as farms and working in the farms or working in driving trucks or driving tractors or stuff. And there were a couple of people from New York, and of course, people can go through a whole career, their whole life in New York and never drive a car because there's public transportation available.
Right.
So it's so I felt like that was one of the things that I had an advantage in. I was familiar with machines and machinery, and of course, like I said, the aerodynamics part of it, there's not much aerodynamics involved with a helicopter. It's you understand, you get the theory of lift and drag and all of that sort of stuff. And really, the once an engine quits on a helicopter, there is no gliding to a safe landing like you would in a fixed wing. In other words, you look down right between your feet, between the pedals where your feet are at, and that's where you're going to wind up. It's there. There isn't looking around, looking out to see, because you'll talk about people with an aircraft engine failure. They usually glide to a field or glide someplace and be able to land, but helicopter is not a rotation, and once the engine quits, you lower the collective, air goes up through the rotor system and keeps it turning. On the bottom, you've got one chance to pull and cushion the landing. That's it. So it's a one-shot operation. So there's not a whole lot of reason why, at least it didn't seem to me. The one thing that I did learn that I did find interesting was the gentleman who taught navigation had been he'd been a high school math teacher in Mineral Wells, and so he immediately took a job teaching navigation. And I had never figured out why, when I was in school and doing trigonometry and all that stuff, I had never, you know how you are. You say, "Well, I'm never going to use this. What the hell uses this?" And when I got into navigation with this math teacher from Mineral Wells, I had the aha moment when we started plotting courses, and the angle of corrections for courses and all that sort of stuff. So that was a pretty interesting experience. Flying in flight school I had a gentleman who had flown in the Korean War. He was one of the first Army aviators, renowned throughout the Army aviation community. And he was my flight instructor. We had two other people. There's three of each instructor had three students, and I just happened to have a couple of Marines, as the Marines had joint training with our in the Army. During Vietnam, Marine pilots, helicopter pilots, came to the Army for initial helicopter training. So it was myself and these two Marines, and you just flew out, you practice round and round, flying straight and level, finding what they call confined areas. In other words, someplace in the trees where you hover down and land and take off, and learning how to gauge where the wind was coming from, and everybody knew how to get out of their helicopter and strap it down and go find a handful of grass, hold it up in the air and drop it and see which way the blades of grass fell. And that's the way I'm going to take off, sort of thing. It was a lot of fun, I have to say. It was just a hell of a lot of fun in flight school.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it. I mean, getting to experience the joys of flying and understanding, the helicopter systems in itself and navigation and low-level flight. I mean, I know I've interviewed some helicopter pilots post-Vietnam, and they mention one of their favorite joys is nap of the earth flying, of just taking it.
I came through the old school flight school flying. In fact, we invented nap of the earth flying in Vietnam. In flight school, you climbed up to 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet, and it was up, and then a nice 15-degree approach coming back down. Even at Fort Rucker, when we finished at Fort Walton and came to Fort Rucker to fly, didn't fly nap of the earth at all. It wasn't a concept at that time. It wasn't an idea. It wasn't until we got a couple of years into the war in Vietnam, we started losing a lot of helicopters to ground fire, that we started figuring out, how do I reduce my exposure to people shooting at me from the ground? Well, if I'm down there real close to the ground, nap of the earth, he'll only see me for a couple of seconds as I flash overhead, and I'm gone. So that was one of the things and we perfected that in the 101st. I remember in the 101st when we were flying that sort of nap of the earth flying, making fast, low approaches. That would get you in trouble if you try to do that back here in the United States or in flight school. And so it was a development of survival. You know, you learn how to survive in wartime. You learn tactics that will save your life. And that was one of the things I really do. Yeah, for the rest of my time in the Army, essentially, other than flying an administrative flight, let's say going from Fort Campbell, where was my last flying assignment, to let's say to one of the cities, or going up to Fort Bragg, up to Fayetteville. Then you would get up and fly up in the what we call the air traffic control system. But around Fort Campbell and around the training areas, we never got more than 10 feet off the tops of the trees, you know, and that brought with it some interesting challenges too. You had to get real smart. We didn't have wire cutters on the front of a helicopter in Vietnam, but somewhat later on, we did. We had these things on the front that would catch wires. I don't know how well it worked, or I don't know if anybody ever had one work. But the idea was, if you go over if you ever drive around Fort Campbell or some of those army bases, and you're driving down the highway, you'll see this big orange balls on the transmission lines, on the
Yep.
electric lines. That's what they're for. So, so they came out of the whole experience of flying low level around those places. So it's just
Well, even with that, well, with the experience that, of course, you have, and just speaking of Nap of the Earth flying, from your perspective, what is that feeling like being Nap of the Earth, moving at treetop level?
there's the only better rush you get and that I've ever experienced was when I went back after Vietnam, and I went back to flight school and went through Cobra school. And when you come in, you know, at 1,000 feet, and you roll the nose over and you start punching rockets off, and the whoosh as they leave the tube is there's just a rush involved with that. Flying is it's a tremendous rush, and especially flying Napa of the Earth. It's just so much fun. It's hard to describe, but I remember talking to some fellow officers one time, and they'd say complaining about something or another, and he said, you bastards, you'd probably pay the army to let you fly. That's the way it is, and here you are getting flight pay for it." and and basically he was right. It was it's a lot of fun, and you get to do things and go places that you know, most people don't, and that they're not in aviation. The other, you know, the one of the fun things to do is, well, they go to air shows, you know, and do flight demonstrations and stuff like that, and then you get to land and sit on the ground and talk to all the people as they come through, and you know, some aviators can tell some tall stories. And they
That's what I've
do,
been told.
and they do. And the other thing is, you know, I had a wonderful experience one time flying from Fort Campbell to Arkansas, to where I forget the name of the base now, but there's a base there where they store all the chemical weapons and everything. And we were flying a group of commanders down there. They were going to coordinate how they were going to secure the base. And we landed at this little small airfield about halfway there. And evidently we flew over the local, probably middle school, as we were approaching the airfield. And the teacher, the one of the teachers there, took his class over to the airfield then, and they're standing behind the fence. This is after we got the Blackhawks, and we had a brand new Black Hawk sitting on the ramp waiting to get refueled. And we went in and had lunch, and we came back out, and kids are all looking there, and their eyes are just, you know, looking at the aircraft. And I said, "Hey, you guys want to come on over and sit in the seat and check the controls out and everything else?" There, oh my gosh, you should see these little boys and little girls. They were just ecstatic, you know. And to me, that was just, I said, I recruited at least a half a dozen new pilots of the Army right there.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. When I was in elementary school, this was probably 2004, 2005, we had a Black Hawk land behind our elementary school. I don't know if it was planned or if it was just circumstance, kind of like this. And they landed in a big field, and the whole school was invited out there to meet with these pilots and to get in the Black Hawk and to sit on it. It was incredible.
Yeah. Well, and to me, it was an incredible aircraft because I had spent my majority of my career flying Hueys, and Hueys were designed in the 50s, and they were mass produced in the early 60s. Notwithstanding that the Iranian president was flying in an old Huey when he went down yesterday morning, which was to me was just amazing that they're still they were flying in that sort of weather and those sorts of
Yeah,
conditions with a Huey from the early 60s. But the Black Hawk was, to me, it's the finest aircraft that's ever been fielded. There's no question about it. And like I said, every once in a while, yeah, you would get an enterprising person at some school. My daughter's a school teacher as well, and she talked to me about it and talked to some people down at the airfield here at Fort Eustis, and they got a Black Hawk and a Chinook to come up and fly to the high school and land and all of that stuff. So again, it's an enterprising teacher usually, or somebody in the school administration, and the Army we're always ready to do something like that. You always find a few hours spare flight training time to do something like that because, again, it's good for recruiting. It's good for the Army's image, as it were, and love to do it.
absolutely. And I'll see what I can maybe try to pull for the students sometime in the future.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And tell them that this is a great recruiting tool. Tell them to coordinate with your local recruiters, and they will work on it for you.
Well, and dealing with that and the recruitment aspect, of course, that's eventually how you get in, is your helicopter ride. Now, as the war progressed, and of course you're going through flight school, were tactics changing on helicopter formation, flying, altitude, or approaches to prepare you for Vietnam?
Yeah, there was a standard let's say curriculum that you went through at Fort Rucker, and there were still at the time there were mass formations, 10, 15 aircraft. And then once you got to Vietnam, it depended on where you were at, whether you would use any of the tactics you used in flight school. If you're down in the what they call the First Corps area, or down in the Delta region, yeah, it was all flat, and there were flat open spaces. You could land flights of 5 or 10 helicopters, on an air assault. Where I was at in the 101st, it was up in I Corps. The largest flight, the largest clearing that I could recall finding out in the mountainous areas, and maybe get 3 ships into it. But normally there were one ship, the one ship LZ as they call them, and the a lot of places there were triple canopy jungle, and they just blew a hole in the jungle, and you came into a hover over the canopy, and then just sort of hovered directly down into the hole. They called them hover holes. And they were constructed but what they called an LZ clearing team. They would have a I see the doggy in the background there.
Yeah, that's Miss Emma.
Yeah. The A squad of engineers on a Chinook and a flight of about 3 Hueys. And the Hueys would go out, and we would rappel out of the aircraft into a clearing or in an area where you were going to cut this LZ. And once you got a couple of people on the ground, they would clear enough to get the rest of the engineer squad down. And then those guys would just sort of clear the area and land there. The other way to do those LZs in I Corps was they had a C-130, and they would drop what they called a daisy cutter. They had a big old 1,000-pound or 5,000-pound bomb. They would drive over where you wanted it, drop that thing, and it just blew a huge hole in the jungle. And so we came in then with the flighty Hueys, and you would if there was a place to land, you would land, and the infantry soldiers would get out with the engineers, and they would have their chainsaws and their axes and whatever, and they would just complete the clearing. And then they would drop a couple of barrels of pentaprime, they called it, oil, used oil to keep the dust down in the summertime. And in the monsoon season and the wet season, you didn't have to worry about it. There was nothing but mud down there anyhow. So most of the LZs that you flew in and out of in the 101st area and the I-Corps area were ones that were, constructed or cut by the soldiers themselves when they were going on an operation. So it was like, yeah, the only time we ever got to fly anything like a normal formation that we learned how to fly in flight school was if we were landing out along the coastline, where they had a sort of a flat area out along the coastline. But it was, yeah, most of the tactics that we learned in flight school, they got modified or reinvented once you got in country. Now I was there from in 69 and 70, so that was fairly well on into the war where there was major operations going on. The time frame I was there was what they called the Vietnamization program. So 90% of the troops that we flew around were Vietnamese troops, ARVN troops, Army of Vietnam troops. And at the time, there was, fewer and fewer American infantry soldiers, American combat troops were getting involved. So it was a bit different flying for the ARVNs because you never knew, you never knew what they were going to do in a lot of cases. And you would tell them to do, you try to get them to do certain things and do certain things off the aircraft or load on. I remember the first time I ever lost a Vietnamese soldier was we were pulling him out of a location, and it was under fire, and they just sort of rushed the aircraft. And in the hot and high weather, in about 6 or 7 soldiers was about the most you could handle, and there was about 10 of them on there. So I'm trying to get the crew chief to, get some of them off and tell them to wait for the next one. And the communication was sort of difficult, but it took off. And as I'm climbing out, there's a guy hanging on the toe of the skid. He had just locked arms around there. And I thought to myself, that's a dead man because he's not going to make it back. And we can't go back in. I mean, there's other aircraft coming in right behind us in the place. And he lasted for about maybe 5 minutes. Finally, his arms gave out and he fell off. I mean, it's one of those things, And I said, but that's how desperate he was to get out of whatever was happening on the ground, which was sad, but those are the breaks, as they say.
Well, and with that, I mean, I've definitely heard some stories like that, but was that a fairly common sight of ARVN being desperate to get out of those fights within your flights?
And in the towards that point of the war, the ARVNs, I don't know. I think that there was a sense probably amongst the ARVN soldiers that nobody cared about them, and they were facing at that time most of the war in the South was irregulars. The Viet Cong, the irregulars, they weren't the whatever, I forget what the name of there were several, 2 or 3 different divisions of these are, the organized Army of Vietnam. They're not North Vietnam soldiers. They were all in trained at heavy weapons and all that sort of stuff. That's what they were facing. And in a lot of cases, the Southern ARVNs, I don't think they had the same commitment, at least the way I sensed it. They had the same commitment to what was going on that the Northern fixed army had. And so you would find them sometimes they just wanted to get out of there. They just wanted to, get on an aircraft and leave. And If it was an American unit, on the other hand, they had, it was an organized pulling out of it, like uh, the Battle of Firebase Ripcord, for instance. There, everybody had a role. Somebody was designated to go, but there was somebody covering them while they were going. And in other words, you got your aircraft number, and that's what you got on. Whereas those ARVNs, it seemed to me like they would just have a whole bunch of them just run to the aircraft landing, and not necessarily wait until whatever organization or maybe lack of organization they had on the ground. It was uh, it was like a mass, jump to get on the bus, as it were.
No,
Which
well, and to that too, I've always been curious about this, especially for you slick pilots. Does the combat weight of the infantrymen, their gear, rifles, and ammunition, does that go into consideration when you go into an LZ to pick up troops?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the pre-briefing, in other words, before I was a platoon leader, so I had 10 aircraft, and you went and got your briefing, and then you went and got the weather report, and then you went and got the altitude of where the LZ was at you're going to be pulling somebody out of. And then you did your weight and balance. You figured out what weight, how much fuel do I have on board when I get there? And then that tells me, based on the standard, 220 or whatever it was, weight we had a company that a soldier would carry, and then the gear that they would carry. And so we had a standard weight that you used for passengers. We had the PAX weight. And so based on that, you would call ahead then to the pathfinders, because usually all of those one of the air assault requirements is there was a pathfinder with every company or every unit that was on the ground, and they're trained to communicate with the aircraft, communicate with the pilots, and they would give you the wind direction, the wind speed, and they would give you whatever obstacles would be on the ground. And most airborne air assault soldiers are trained on that, so they understand. Even your basic private in the air assault business, he understands that helicopters need to take off into the wind if they have a heavy load, and he needs to tell them if there are wires, if there are any obstacles in the pickup zone. So before you would fly a mission in Vietnam, you knew I would tell them, okay, it'll be a 5-pack lift or a 6-pack lift or 4. I've seen it get down as low as 4, because you're up at a mountain about 3,500 feet on the edge of the A Shau Valley. There's just, you're running out of power to lift at that stage. So there was a whole lot of planning that went into deciding how many people would get on your airplane and how many people, what sort of gear they had and stuff like that. And some of them the Pathfinder would come back and say, you'll have 2 packs, but he'll have this, chunk of equipment with him. He might have a radio relay unit or something, something that was weighed whatever amount of weight that would be the equivalent of 1 or 2 or 3 passengers. So yes, there was a lot that went into a mission in terms of it wasn't just jump in and and crank it up and go. You had to know who you were getting. You had to know, in addition to all of the standard Army stuff like the radio frequencies and that sort of thing, you had to know how are these people equipped. Sometimes on an operation they would go light. They would only carry basic water and ammunition, and so they were only going to be on the ground for a day or maybe a couple of hours or a day and a half. And if they were going to be going out and spending some time on a patrol, then each individual weighed about twice as much as the guys that were going out for a light mission, because they were carrying food, they were carrying water, they were carrying extra ammunition and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, you needed to know what sort of mission these people were on. And then you needed to know how long they'd been out there. If they'd been out there for 4 or 5 days, well, they weren't going to have a hell of a lot except for themselves and their personal gear coming back in, because they weren't going to be bringing back in empty water bottles, or they throw away any of the excess stuff they had.
Well, and two, and I guess within the briefing aspect of when you mentioned the type of LZ, I guess that's where you know if it's a cool LZ, a warm LZ, or a hot LZ?
Oh, absolutely. You knew that. Well, you didn't know that necessarily when you were starting off, but you would. One of the things that used to happen fairly regularly was um, the North Vietnamese, their military was pretty sharp. They would sense, they could tell from how long these people had been on the ground that they were going to be picked up. They would monitor radio traffic. They knew when they were going to be picked up, and they would then get around. They would come around the LZ and they or put themselves in a position to be able to engage you. And even though that the guys on the ground told you that it was cold, it was quiet, when you started going in there, you got shot at. There was also cases where the guys on the ground they wanted to get out of there. So they might have had fire going on, but they wouldn't tell you about it. They would they would not tell you about it until you headed inbound and you got shot at. And I would have to say 99% of the time is you kept on going in to get them anyhow. That was just that's the way things worked. But you certainly knew by reputation if you were talking to somebody said, that son of a bitch, he told me he had a cold LZ, last week or something like that. And I got several aircraft shot at when we were out there. So just be careful, guys, when you're going in to him. So it was, I mean, he got very personal. One thing about flying to me in over there was that was different than a lot of the pilots had. We had a unique advantage in the 101st and in the 82nd and the two what they call air assault divisions at the time. You flew for the same people all the time. In other words, you supported the same unit all the time. I knew some of the guys that were the company commanders on the ground. They had been in OCS with me as infantry officers, so you knew who you were talking to. Whereas if you were with some of the people in the 1st Aviation Brigade, which were supported the whole rest of the country, they flew missions, came up on a mission board, and you went out and supported these guys. You probably didn't know them. You probably didn't have the same relationship with them that we had in the 101st. So I always felt like I was very fortunate to have had that experience, to be with a unit that stayed together all the time, supported the same people all the time, and got to know each other. The Cobra Company was part of our battalion, the gunships. They knew us. I mean, I'm in contact on Facebook on a fairly regular basis with the first platoon leader of the Redskins, which was the gun company that covered us. And when we went in on a hot LZ or something like that, the amount of communication I needed to have with the gunships wasn't the same as it would have been if I'd been flying maybe in another part of the country. Because he knew how I flew. He knew which way, based on looking at the ground, looking at the terrain, he knew which way I was going to brake when I came out of the LZ, and he would modify his turn to cover that. Whereas if I was flying with somebody else, you'd have to tell them, okay, I'm going to go left when I come out, and I'm going to go right, or just a whole lot of more radio traffic than flying with the same people you flew with every day, been supported by the same people you got supported by every day. So it just made life a lot easier.
Well,
If
and that sense of camaraderie too, and building that cohesion, that creates one hell of a fighting force.
Oh, it does, absolutely. And that was the advantage I thought that the air, what they, ultimately it's the 101st now, what the air assault division, the air assault operations gave us, or gave the Army, that capability. Training together all the time, training with the same infantry units, training with the same artillery units. It just made life, again, as we said, the camaraderie, the knowledge of how they operated, and working with the same set of rules as they do. It just made life a lot easier, a lot uncomplicated, a lot of different things.
Well, and to get into some more specifics here, for the infantry on the ground, what specific regiments and battalions within the 101st were you supporting and working with on the ground?
Well, I worked with all of them, but mainly we worked in the 3rd Brigade. Um, second of 327, the first of 501st, first of 506th. I'd have to go back and look at the division TONE at this stage. But, I just remember the 506 worked with it all the time. Worked with the 327th. And it just, like I said, I knew some of the guys that were the company commanders. I knew some of the people that were the operations officers because they were all infantry officers that were in the infantry. And I'd gone through infantry OCS. And several of them were classmates, so you just you'd know them on the radio. You didn't even need to talk about a call sign or whatever. You knew Joe was on the other end of the radio when you talked to him on the ground. And they essentially knew who you were, and they didn't have to tell. If they said it was serious, I knew it was serious, in other words. And if they said, I need you to, they were looking for resupply at night in the dark without any of the modern day night vision goggles or night vision capabilities that we have today, or even towards the end of the war. If they said that they were desperate for supply at night and they needed somebody to come do it for them, well, you just went and did it for them. It was a bit, it was sketchy most of the time. But again, the guy, you shoot a night approach into a dark LZ and the guy with the strobe light down there. And the question always was, is that a strobe light or a muzzle flash? When you're approaching at night, because you can't see anything, and you don't want to turn on your landing light or your nav lights because that's just creating a target.
Well, and another benefit that you mentioned here of knowing the guys who are out there, it creates that sense of urgency of when it's on the line, you know that they're going to do everything to protect you and you're going to do everything to protect them. And once again, it builds that cohesion that is necessary for a fighting force.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And again, one of the things that people would ask, in the intervening years, I've had so many infantry soldiers and people come and said, oh, they figure out or talk to you and find out that you flew helicopter and you flew slicks and said, oh my God, guys, I'm here today because you guys were there. And it's a very gratifying feeling to feel like you were that important to somebody. It didn't seem so at the time, obviously, but the idea was we had this thing in our company, in our unit, the Ghost Riders, that the only reason we were there was to support the infantry. We weren't there to fly and get hours or anything else. We were there to support the infantry soldiers, and there wasn't anything we wouldn't do to get down there and to help them. And we took chances, and most of them worked out. To fly, you flew past when you return. You had a time frame on a flight where you have to turn around. You can't continue. You can't keep going. You're going to run out of fuel, and so we had a 20-minute warning light. In other words, you computed your fuel, obviously, and you computed all that, and it varied a little bit depending on the weather, on the winds, and that sort of thing. But I remember getting down into 10 or 15 minutes into my 20-minute warning light, and I, I said, I know that there's one or two places I can land on the way back, and if I have to, but if you can get them on board and get them back, that's what it was all about.
Well, and with that, part of that warning light aspect, of course, knows going into knowing your aircraft, the fuel load, how it operates, where you can trim it in itself, and that's the skill that you pilots and crew bring to this.
Yeah, and the part of the thing was I talked earlier about the knowing the weight. You had we had the first the last thing you did before you actually took off. When you cranked up, you went through your pre-flight, went through your firing up the aircraft, doing all your checks. You pulled out of what we had revetments, big walls on each side of the aircraft to keep from damage from mortar attacks. And you pulled out of there, and then you sat down and you zeroed everything out, and then you started pulling power. And we did what they used to call a hit check. And the hit check was the health indicator test on the engine. And they would tell you you had a couple of calculations you made based on the amount of torque you were pulling on the engine and the turbine outlet temperature, how hot the exhaust got. And then based on that, you could say, okay, so they've got an ACL of 6, in other words, out there that you can pick up and say, I'm only going to be able to take 5. Because if I take 6, I'm not going to be able to get them off the ground safely. There were a few times when I recall on the edge of the Ashaw Valley, I had 5 and I took a 6th on board, because if you could pick it up just enough to slide off the edge of the mountain, you could pick up enough speed then to, get your forward momentum going. But the whole trick was getting enough power to pick up at a hover and then start to take off. And yes, you could fly with 6 or 7 on board, but you couldn't actually take off with that many on board. It was, it was just an interesting thing. And you had a pilot and a co-pilot, and normally speaking, the aircraft commander did all of that stuff, but you had the pilot do it all as well, and he did. And it was training for him to become an aircraft commander. And then the crew chiefs. Some of the crew chiefs, door gunners, they tend to get overlooked in some of these stories. But the crew chief was a smart fella too. He was the one that maintained the engine, and he knew basically they would watch the pilots. And I had crew chiefs telling me in later years that some pilots they trusted to do the calculations, and he said, and others they would say, "Hey, wait a minute, sir, would you do that again?" And the crew chief, they knew how to do the same calculation on the engine power part. And they would watch what was going on. They would watch the gauges. They would watch how hot it was getting, and how much torque you were pulling. Because if you over torque the engine, that was a big deal, because even though you might be able to take off and fly, when you get back and landed, then based on how much extra power you had to pull, they might have to change out the whole freaking engine and transmission on it, because you might have, you know, strained something that might last for a few more hours, but maybe not. So that was, and I always my crew chief. In fact, my crew chief saved my life one time. But I trusted implicitly that he knew what he was talking about, and he knew what he was doing. And he had gone to Fort Rucker at the same time as I was in flight school, and spent all that time in the academic classroom taking engines apart, putting them back together again, and taking rotor systems and transmissions apart and putting them together again. So they were pretty smart guys, and they contributed so much to the whole operation. And the door gunners, most of our door gunners were people who had been in the infantry and were given an opportunity to fly. They would say, okay, getting ready to, if you extend for 6 months, that was the deal they used to give them. So they got 18 months in country from some of those guys instead of 12, which was a normal tour. But he got to leave the field, after 8 or 9 months. They were sort of wore out being on the ground in the infantry. And they would see us in the aircraft, and we were back at base. One of the differences between being an infantry officer who flew and an infantry officer who was in the infantry was I slept in a freaking warm bed every night, and I had regular, mess hall food, whereas they slept out there on the ground and ate sea rations.
Yep.
So there was, that was one of the things that they would say, you guys just can't imagine. And I would say, I cannot imagine having spent a year on the ground in Vietnam. It was just not something I ever thought of myself doing.
Well, most certainly not. I mean, I can't wrap my head around it in itself, let alone, even the combat missions that you fly in and participate in as well there. Now, as you go through flight school, and of course, you go through this extra training, of course, when did you finally get your orders that were bound for Vietnam?
I got my orders in November 1969. And Uh, yeah, November 1969. I got there right before Christmas. And of course, the big thing then in November 69 and going into the Christmas season was the concern that there was going to be a Tet offensive, the same as there was in 1968, but that never materialized. Um, I had spent a year at Fort Hood before I went over there, so I had been flying regularly at Fort Hood. So I had about 600 hours in a Huey by that time.
Wow.
And so once I got there, I got to a company and Alpha Company 158th Aviation called the Ghost Riders. And they had about five or six other captains in the unit at the time. And it was two platoon leaders. And within about a month after I got there, company commander called me in and said, I'm going to make you the first platoon leader. And I was surprised because they had several senior captains in the company. And I said, okay, what about, he said, he said, I'm the company commander, I decide. And so that was it. And even though there were several people who were, I would say, justifiably upset and felt dissed and everything else by the whole experience, I became the platoon leader. And I was the platoon leader for pretty much the whole tour, except for the last 2 months I was there. I was the operations officer. But it was strictly, I think, because of the experience I had when I got there. And I guess he just liked the way I approach things. I mean, it's all when you're in combat and you're deciding who's going to be the leader of this or that or the other as a commander or a leader. It's all comes down in a lot of cases to a gut feeling about it. I like the way this guy thinks and operates, and this other guy not so much. So I was fortunate in that company commander, he just thought I was the man for the job, as it were. And I flew 1,100, almost 1,200 hours. And unlike a lot of people who would fly support missions a lot, most of all of my flying time was combat assaults or combat extractions because I was the platoon leader, the most of the, as they used to call them, the ash and trash missions and the milk runs were done by the brand new warrant officers getting to the company, getting in country. And you built up your flight time doing that sort of thing, and then you wound up going out and doing combat assaults and so on.
Well, and with that too, I know that with the 158, you have Alpha, you've got Bravo companies, the Lancers, Charlie
Yeah,
Company was Phoenix, if I'm
Phoenix.
not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so when these combat assaults take place as well, you've got these very supporting arms, and with the battalion, I know that the battalion's taking casualties pretty regularly by the time you arrive there, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yes, we were. In fact, within the first month I was there, we lost two aircraft, and one of them was one of my hooch mate. We called them hooches, a hut. He he went out flying and he did the classic mistake, what we would refer to as it was monsoon, so the tops of the mountains, generally speaking, were covered with clouds, and a lot of times people would call you and you would go out there and you could hear them, you could see the mountain they were on, but you couldn't get to them because we didn't fly. There was no instrument flying in Vietnam. There was no such thing as we didn't have any of the instrumentation that you have on a modern, for instance, a Black Hawk, where you can, do all sorts of different things. But they'd throw if you were looking for somebody in that sort of a scenario, you had them throw a smoke grenade, a colored smoke grenade, and they would say the grenade was out, and if you could see the color, because if they said we're throwing a purple grenade, for instance, you'd see purple grenades coming out all over the friggin' place because the NVAs weren't stupid. They would listen. They were monitoring the radios too. And if somebody said purple grenade, then they just throw some money, get you to come land at their location. But best we can figure is that he went out and they threw a grenade and he saw the base of a cloud, the smoke mixed with the cloud, and he tried to push it that 10 feet too far up into the cloud. And obviously, when we found them later on, about a week later, the infantry guys said, well, we heard a crash, and we can't get to it. And we couldn't get to it for about a week, and we finally did. Again, just poked into the trees or poked into the side of a mountain. Uh, we were losing, off and on aircraft here and there. Not a lot of, most of them were, well, we had several of them who were survivable. The only ones that were not survivable were usually the ones who did that, who flew into a cloud or flew up into the clouds. But, you get shot down and, get it on the ground and somebody could come in and get you. And yeah, the aircraft is a total loss, but we were able to recover the crews. Everybody, they used to have competitions and draw lots to see who was going to fly with me because I was Irish. My call sign was Irish, and in the company, my call sign was Irish, and I had the luck of the Irish. Flew 1,100 and something combat hours and never took a round in the aircraft the
How
whole
many
time.
missions is that, if I may ask? If you
Oh,
have an idea. God.
you know, probably, in an hour you could do 2 or 3 missions in some cases, depending, but probably 1,000 or more, or
Wow.
1,500 missions, different individual missions.
It's
And
incredible.
some, and some missions would be, I remember the day we did the extraction off ripcord. It was 12-hour flying day. And I was so tired by the time I got back that we landed back at the base at Camp Evans. And when I landed, I just came up to the edge of the opening of the revetment, and you had to hover in and be careful because I had this 5 foot tall wall on each side, and so you had to be real. It was a neat bit of flying to put it in there safely, and I couldn't do it. And the co-pilot, he tried it, couldn't do it. And we set the aircraft down, and I remember calling up operations and say, "Look, I need somebody to come down and park my airplane." And so somebody did. One of the guys was in operations, but you'd been flying for 12 hours. You had stress going the whole time. Your adrenaline was high. You were having shakes by that time. And that happened quite often where people would get so tired, so stressed out that they weren't able to park at the end of the day.
Well, and I think for people who will see this interview that perhaps don't understand, flying's one challenge, but flying into a hot LZ or flying a combat assault, the stress that's involved with that, the focus that you have to have, I mean, that's every ounce of your mental and physical
Yeah,
energy to do your
yeah,
job.
yeah. And it was not uncommon, if you were flying a very stressful mission like that and you had 3 or 4 hours of it, you get up, you go walking off to the side from your aircraft ground and you just throw up. You just stomach, it's the adrenaline, it just is so high the whole time you're there that you're just sick to your stomach when it's all over with. And yes, there's no other thing I've ever done that was the same amount of stress in terms of, I don't know if we called it stress at the time. They used to have 120 hours in 30 days. And so as you completed every day, the 30th day back, that number of hours dropped off the total. And if it was over 120 hours, you had to go see the flight surgeon, and he had to do an evaluation to see if you were safe to fly more, and an additional 10 hours was a no-brainer. You, you, he gave you that without even, he wouldn't even look in your, he didn't shine a light in your eye or anything and see if your eye was following the light. He said, "What do you need? I need a flight extension." And if he gave you 10 hours, more than likely, then there was a few days in the previous 30 to 29 to 28 day where you had a low flying day, you were able to continue on flying. So I mean, I bumped into that on a regular basis.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, and the flight hours and through all of this, and to kind of end our first segment here, how did you relax once you get back and the mission's over? Do you go have a beer? Do you go try to get some sleep? What do you do to de-stress?
It depended. A lot of times we had a little unit club, where somebody had procured a couple of coolers, and there was cold beer. There was usually really, no problem getting a lot of uh, booze and wine and whatnot. So you would go back. But the problem was if you were flying fairly regularly, you couldn't, yeah, you could have a beer or two to relax. So that was, you had to cut it off at that point because you're going to fly the next day. There is nothing. Your head, there's no way that anybody could describe how your head feels if you tied one on the night before and then you had to go out and fly a high stress mission the next day. And for all of those people who tell you they used to do that and drink that all the time, that is baloney. You couldn't, it didn't work. You'd kill yourself to start with, but most of the time your head was so bad that you just, no. Air sick? Can you imagine flying in the turbulence in the mountains after having a hangover from the day before
Good
or the night
God.
before? It would not, it only happened to me once that I wound up having to fly a mission after I was assured that I wasn't flying the next day. And myself and a fellow from the other platoon, we went down and we're drinking Matus wine. And I cannot even look at the Matus bottle to this day without getting the dry heaves. And about 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock the following morning, there's the CQ, the shake my shoulder. Somebody was sick or something happened, and I got to fly. You got to fly. You got to fly. I said, "Who am I flying with?" He told me who I was flying with. I said, "Okay, I'll do it," because I knew he could fly. He didn't need me. He just needed the weight in the seat. So, so yeah, you went back to the hooch, and you may or may not have had a little, individual like the dorm cooler in your hooch, with some cold drinks and maybe a beer or two, or you went to the club to drink. And then you sat down and sort of tried to construct a letter back to your wife or whatever. I'd been married just slightly less than a year when I headed to Vietnam, so everybody was the same way. You tried to get some correspondence done and then try to sleep. And it wasn't too bad in the cooler weather, but in the warm weather, trying to sleep in the heat and the humidity, and they have serious big bugs flying around in Vietnam, mosquitoes and stuff. So beating them off was part of the drill as well.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and to think about all of this too, with the stress as well, but it's also in many ways, many veterans, the people that you meet along the way in these environments, the lifelong friendships that are formed in the stress of combat are tested over the years.
We are having a reunion of my flight school class in September. We get together every 2 years. Uh, the Ghostwriters have had regular reunions for the last 35 years now, and we get together and sometimes getting together with those guys, you can talk about things that you don't talk to anybody else about. You know, things that happened that you wouldn't. People just wouldn't understand is how I've heard some of those guys explain it. They wouldn't, And some people just can't talk to anybody about it. They can't talk to people about it. It's hard for me to imagine that. I don't mind talking to people about it. I don't mind. I think it's healthy to be able to, you get things out. There's PTSD. My heart bleeds for some of the people that I run into, that they're still living the horror of what they went through. They're living the stress that they went through. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, it is what it is, and you deal with it and move on. But that doesn't work for everybody. They really do need to. We need to do a better job, I think, of and I think we do nowadays, of post-combat stress and debriefing. There was nothing like that when we finished in Vietnam. I came back from Vietnam. I came back to Fort Lewis, Washington, I think it was in my case, and changed out of my uniform, went to the PX and bought a shirt and a pair of blue jeans and went and got on a commercial plane and, flew back to Connecticut where my wife was living at. I didn't experience any, what do you call it? Hippies at the airport spitting on you and calling you a baby killer and any of that stuff. Never saw that. Never, there might have been a few incidents of that. I'm sure people have experienced it, but there wasn't anybody like that. I came back to the family that I had left from, that I'd come to stay with in the United States. They were all, the Irish diaspora that live in the New York, New Jersey area. They were all pro whatever. They, hey, pat you on the back, great job, and that's it, you're home. But there wasn't any. Yeah, TV had marches and all that stuff, and poor old John Kerry, bless his soul, he was tossing his medals or his ribbons over the wall of the Pentagon. I mean, that was just stuff happening on TV to me. I really don't think it affected me, and probably most of the people that were in the company, because we've talked about it again over the years. And the only person that we were ever all in complete agreement on that was a terrible human being was Jane Fonda. It seems to be a thing. We just hated Jane Fonda, and because of what she did, or with the POW situation. So everybody can agree with that. But other than that, yeah, okay, it was what it was.
I find that fascinating too, of the agreements on Jane Fonda. I don't think I've ever met a Vietnam veteran who was too fond of her.
Well, and that's is probably a cultural thing as well. The very idea that she got accused of passing the gentleman passed away here recently in Williamsburg. He ran for vice president with, oh, I can't think of it. Ross Perot. And he was the guy who linked the Morse code to the delegation that she was a member of. But there was a story that he had rolled up a tiny little piece of cigarette paper with the names of prisoners who hadn't been known that they were there yet, and passed it to her, and she supposedly passed it to the jailers for the NVA. And so, whether it's a true story or not, it is a legendary story amongst the Vietnam veterans, that and the fact that she sat especially for the Air Force and the Navy pilots, but for us too, that she sat on that friggin' anti-aircraft gun with the helmet on her and got her picture taken aiming at the sky. That
Doesn't do you any favors.
that didn't no, it didn't do her any favors either. And all we have to do is think about that picture. We're ready to have some serious heartburn with the lady.
No kidding. Well, speaking of these reunions, of course, I know I'll be at 3 this year. Just by circumstance, would you happen to be at the Ripcord Association reunion this year?
That one's going to be in Myrtle Beach, is it?
Yes, sir.
When is it?
Um, October. I think it's the week before Halloween, something like that. It's sometime in October, though.
Yes, I probably will be. I have not been to one yet, but I probably will go to that one because we're having our flight class reunion one the last week in the 23rd through the 26th of September. And so from that point on, I don't have any other, social commitments and whatnot. And from here in Williamsburg, I probably just drive down to Myrtle Beach. But
Well,
that's
go
been
ahead,
one
sir.
on my on my bucket list to go to.
Well, and I'll edit this out, of course, for the interview, but I've been invited there as well because I want to talk with the men who are there at Ripcord, and of course, be in your association with it. So we'll be able to meet each other there and continue aspects of the interviews in person here in October. So I'm very excited for that opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Looking
As long
forward
as
to
you,
that.
as long
Yeah.
as you don't mind the historian having a drink and pestering you with questions.
No, I think it's important. I think that my my son-in-law is the vice president of historical operations here at Colonial Williamsburg, and my granddaughter is and she wants to be a historian. So I think that historians are very important people. They do something that quite honestly nobody else does or can grip. And if you have a decent historian or somebody who gets the facts or whatever, yeah, that's important. I think it's important that we capture not just the generals and the prime ministers and the whatever take on things, getting the perspective of what that private soldier who was sitting on the hill on Ripcord on the last day waiting to get pulled out. I think it's very important to get his perspective on what happened. Or is he the guy who picked up Colonel Lucas, who died on the hill, and loaded him on aircraft? What was he thinking that day? And that, to me, is that's what history is about there at that point.
Well, and that's it's one of the reasons I set out on this goal. Oh gosh, I guess about 2 years ago. Um, I'd interviewed veterans before, but never anything serious, and I wanted to record those stories so they're not forgotten because it does tell us our past, and it's not just a general's overview. It's your story of flying into the LZ at Ripcord in itself and what you're seeing, and what is a ground on the ground seeing as you're coming in, and what are they thinking? To get
Yeah,
those overlapping stories to tell the
yeah,
full picture, it's phenomenal.
yeah. And you're tying together two things there. To me, again, it wasn't until much later on that I started to run into people who, when they came back from Vietnam, that was their last tour in the army. That was the last thing they did. Their whole idea, their whole experience was wrapped up in that battle, and they have come to me and said, "My God, I'm so thankful for you guys. You saved us. You came and got us." And I thought to myself, when I started hearing that, I started thinking, you know, I spent the next 28 years in the army, doing the same thing over and over and doing different aspects of things. But to me, that was a defining moment in that person's life. One of the things that really struck me on the way out of Ripcord on one of the last lifts is big, big sergeant in the back of the aircraft, um, African American soldier, jumps up and wraps his arms around my neck, the helmet. He said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He said, "We thought we were going to die. You come and got us." And I'm trying to push this guy off me. I'm trying to fly here. Sit down. But it wasn't until later I realized that, my God, they did think they were going to die. They did think that they weren't going to get off of there. And the only way that there was no other way off except on a helicopter. Ripcord had no way in and no way out except through the air. So there was no roads, there was no A&E and through the because it was completely surrounded by regular army, North Vietnamese army. That was it. You were either going to come out on a helicopter the way you went in, or you weren't coming out at all. And
Exactly
so,
right.
yeah, that was that was pretty awesome thought to come to. And to me, it was a mission. I flew in and flew out, and that's what I did all the time. And there wasn't any question about whether they were going to do it or not. There was some people have asked me over the years, well, why did you go back and, how come you went back in there and got and you did that? And I always, I said, well, there was Americans on the ground. There were soldiers on the ground. There were guys there were other guys. Our comrades were on the ground. If not me, who? How are they going to get out of there? You make that calculation and you go get them, and you're either successful or you're not. And there were a number of aircraft that went down, and we didn't lose any crew members. We lost. I started the day with 10 aircraft on that mission at Ripcord, and I had 4 flyable by the end of the day. 4, myself and three others.
Jesus.
The rest of them all had been shot up, and 2 of them were out there in the woods someplace. We were able to get down and get the crews out, but they were lost aircraft, and the rest of them were so badly shot up that some of them they evacuated right away. A couple of them, we were able to put back into after a significant amount of maintenance. But that was the experience of all the other companies that were there. I think there was 60, somewhere along the line, I have 69 or 68 total aircraft on the division aircraft that started the day, and no doubt every last one of them had the same thing, the same experience.
Jesus.
Have you had a chance to read the Remembering Firebase Ripcord by Christopher Brady?
I've got it right now. Yes, sir.
Okay. Um, Probably around, it may save you something, probably around 360 something to several pages of it. I gave him a fairly long and detailed interview of what it was like and what the weather was like and all that sort of stuff there. But I find that to be a very interesting. It's not the same as Keith Nolan's Ripcord or General Harrison's Hell on a Hilltop. They're more, well, not so much Ripcord, Nolan's book, but they're more of a technical sort of thing. And I think that Brady, for whatever reason, to me anyhow, he got more of the conversational sort of interviews with the people who were there on the hill. So, yeah, yeah, I think that General Harrison, well, he passed away within the past year or so, I think.
2021, 2022, something super
2021,
recent.
2022, yeah. I occasionally hear from his daughter-in-law, I think it is. It's on Facebook. And I had commented at some stage on him. He was a soldier. Of all the generals I've run into over the years, yeah, he was a guy. He was a guy. He was one of the guys. Lots of people who come through that and make it all the way to general officer. Yeah, they have a different perspective. But General Harrison never stopped been concerned about soldiers. Back about 10 years ago, we had one soldier in the unit, our unit, that didn't get an award that he felt like he should have been awarded for the Operation Ripcord. So he talked to some people about getting an award, and somehow or another it got to General Harrison, and I was sitting here at home one day and gets a call from General Harrison, and he says, "I know who you are, and how about?" And he went through the story that he had heard, and I went back and pulled out some old notes and called some of the other people in the unit and the Ghost Riders and talked about it. And so we eventually got a Distinguished Flying Cross for Larry Crash Kern. His name was Crash because he crashed so often. That was the call sign. Everybody had their individual call signs, and that was the one he had.
That's incredible. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, and through that too, this is one of the reasons why I'm talking to you is those little stories that you don't hear if you read the technical reports. You've got to get down to the personal level.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Well,
Well,
whenever you're free, perhaps later this week, if not next week, I'd love to do part two, if that's all right.
oh, that's fine. What's your, well, let me look at the calendar here and see. I don't think there's anything going on this week. Anytime after 7 on most evenings, or I'm available, and unless I'm out doing something. Yeah, Thursday or Friday should, yeah, Wednesday is the 22nd. That's my granddaughter's birthday, so I might
That's an
be
important
doing
day.
something. I might be doing something. And then Memorial Day, and yeah. In fact, the following week, the 30th, 31st, my wife was taken off to visit family in Ireland. So I'll be in the house all by myself, no distractions. So if you want to try to do something on those days, that'd be primo.
Perfect. Well, let's do the 30th at let's say 6 p.m. and we'll go from there.
Yeah, that's fine. 6 p.m.
Fantastic.
on the 30th. I
Well,
can do that.
thank you. And I always do this for all the veterans. Sincerely, thank you for your service and welcome home.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I know that you know what it means to say welcome home. It's not the stock phrase you hear from the Turk in the various stores who figures out you're a veteran. So thanks a lot. And I'll talk to you on the 30th at 6-ish.
Thank you. And if you need anything from me between now and then or whatnot, just let me know. But thank you. This was amazing.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a good night now.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.